I came across a curious story recently where a deaf interpreter seems to be working in court. It's an interesting one for many reasons. One reason is that it happens in Ballinrobe, County Mayo, quite a bit away from the urban centres of Ireland. Another is that it shows that using different accounts in different newspapers, along with other records like the Census of Ireland, can help us form a more complete picture of the past, but still leave so many gaps that are impossible to fill in. Martin Joyce was from Ballinrobe and was sent to Cabra in 1868 by the local Ballinrobe Poor Law Guardians. He completed his education in Cabra after 6 years. At that time, that meant a complete term of education. Not only was Martin a successful scholar, but on his leaving Cabra, he returned home to Ballinrobe and personally thanked the Guardians for the opportunity he had been given at education and learning a trade, in Martin's case, shoemaking. He also brought references from St. Joseph's as to his good character. In fact, they had given him a set of shoemaker's tools when he left. Martin doesn't appear often in the court records of Ballinrobe, and even less so in the local newspapers. In 1879, he brought a hearing man named Michael Farraher to court on a charge of assault. The newspapers reported that the locals wondered how communication was going to be possible in court. Ballinrobe at that time had the use of a county interpreter for Irish language court cases. Was it he who would have to try and interpret? However, neither party appeared in the end when the case was called. A good few years later, in 1896, Martin again went to court seeking justice. It appeared that Martin had again accused another man, this time named Thomas Hancock, of assault, and the two men went to the local Ballinrobe Petty Sessions Court. From two other newspaper articles that I had found previously, it seemed that Martin had handed in a written statement to the court detailing what had happened. Martin's solicitor, named Kerwin, raised the point that, according to a legal handbook used widely at the time, written by Constantine Molloy, an interpreter would be necessary for this hearing. This is interesting in itself. Molloy's book does state this, but this point isn't raised very often at this time in persuading courts to provide an interpreter. And that happened very infrequently indeed at petty sessions level. Apparently, it took some time to find someone qualified. Of course, this wouldn't have meant trained, it just meant able to do the job. But they eventually found someone, a man named Michael, or Mike, Kelly, from Ballinrobe, who attempted to speak for the court what Martin was signing. In these two newspaper accounts, not much else is said about Mike Kelly. The details of the case itself were pretty mundane. There was disagreement about whether the assault actually happened, and in the end, the case was dismissed after a patient hearing by the magistrates. Recently, however, I came across a newspaper account of the same case that revealed some interesting extra detail. The new article in the Galway Observer adds two facts. Firstly, that Michael Kelly's interpretation wasn't very clear to the court, but also that Kelly appeared to be deaf himself. This article describes the interpreter as being nearly as deaf and dumb as himself, in other words, as Martin Joyce. But this point isn't mentioned at all in the other two newspaper articles. At one point, the chairman of the court states that he could understand more from the dummy than from the interpreter. The use of the word dummy is obviously a pretty awful thing to read now in the year 2023. But the point here, though, is that Mike Kelly's attempts to speak for Martin weren't very clear to the court. The article also mentioned that Mike Kelly signed questions to Martin, but obviously we have no way of knowing how good an interpreter he was. Did he use ISL like Martin did, or something else? The newspaper doesn't say. So, who was Mike Kelly? Maybe he was able to hear and speak to the extent that he could function as an interpreter for Martin. It's not clear in the newspaper articles whether Martin asked Mike to do this job for him or not. Perhaps some local people knew Mike was deaf, and on this basis he was sought out for the job. Had Mike also gone to Cabra? Did he know ISL fluently? I had a look at the CIDD reports and the list of past pupils of St. Joseph's, and I can't find a Mike or Michael Kelly from Ballinrobe. It's doubtful that he was a private pupil, as he doesn't seem to have come from a wealthy family. He may have attended another deaf school. In the 1901 and 1911 censuses, there is a Michael Kelly living in Glebe Street in Ballinrobe. In 1901, Mike is there living with his mother Mary, but no mention is made on the census form of Mike being deaf or any reference to hearing loss. In 1911, Mike appears to be living on his own in the same house, his mother having passed away. In the 1911 census form, however, two things caught my eye. Firstly, Mike is described as dumb only, and also that he cannot read. It's important to understand that in both 1901 and 1911, the census form for Mike and his mother was filled in by someone on their behalf, as they could both not read or write. This was probably a policeman whose job it was to work to help illiterate people fill in their forms and collect them afterwards. Mike was described as being unable to read in the census form both years, 1901 and 11. This probably indicates that he never went to school at all, let alone a deaf school. But even this we can't be 100% sure about. The 1911 form, mentioning that he was dumb only, is even more interesting. The census forms allowed only certain options for this column: deaf and dumb or dumb only. In practice, many people stated other things to try to capture their own self-perception of their ability to speak and hear, etc. In this case, the policeman, when presented in 1901 with Mike Kelly, may have felt that he was not, in his view, deaf and dumb, but not quite dumb only either. And so he left it blank. But in 1911, a different policeman, helping with the census, may have had a different impression. They might have considered Mike to be not quite deaf and dumb, as he possibly had some hearing and/or speech, but the options allowed by the form did not capture this, and so the policeman decided to describe him as dumb only, regardless of the accuracy of that. So, if this is the Mike Kelly who interpreted for Martin Joyce a few years earlier, it doesn't appear to have been a fellow Cabra pupil. Did Mike sign? He must have had some ability to do so, or he wouldn't have been called to interpret. So how did he come to learn sign language, and why? I think the answer is interesting, and it appears a few months after the 1896 case. There was another court case that didn't involve Martin or Mike at all, at least not directly. At the time, there were strict laws about licensed premises and opening hours, and publicans would often appear in court if it seemed they had allowed people to drink after hours. In November of 1896, a publican named Gaynor was in the Ballinrobe court, accused of stopping police entering his pub late one night to check to see who was there. The details of that case don't really interest us here, but there's one really interesting piece where Gaynor talks about some of the local people who had been in the pub that night. And he mentions Martin Joyce and Mike Kelly having been in the pub together the same night. It's a very small piece of evidence, but makes sense. Martin and Mike, both marginalised among the town's population, were able to communicate more easily with each other and became friends at some point before the original 1896 court case, where Mike interpreted. Mike may have learnt ISL from Martin, to the extent that he could interpret for him around the town. Maybe he learnt ISL from Martin in that same pub over a good few pints of porter, over many months or even years. Mike may not have had a clear enough voice for the court, but he may indeed have been good company for Martin Joyce, no doubt isolated in late 19th century Ballinrobe, where there were few, if any, other deaf people. As for Martin himself, it isn't clear whether his shoemaking business was successful in Ballinrobe after the court case. In 1901, it appears Martin was in Ballinrobe workhouse. His fortunes had changed by 1911, and Martin was listed as one of 4 servants working for Patrick Murphy, a local shopkeeper. Martin died in 1912 from cancer. He died back in the workhouse hospital. Just 4 years later, in 1916, Mike Kelly also died in the same workhouse hospital, again of cancer.